The rain came down in heavy, relentless sheets, drenching the quiet town of Havenport in a storm so sudden, so ferocious, that it seemed to rip the very fabric of normalcy apart. The wind howled through the streets, rattling windows, tearing at the branches of the towering pines that lined the coastal road. The ocean, usually a calming, rhythmic presence against the cliffs, churned violently, its waves crashing against the rocks in a deafening roar. Kai Donovan gripped the steering wheel of his truck, knuckles white as he fought against the wind that threatened to shove him off course. He had checked the weather that morning. There had been no storm in the forecast, no sign of an incoming front, no warnings, nothing. And yet, here it was. The sky had turned an eerie shade of greenish blue, unnatural, electric, as if something beyond comprehension was stirring in the heavens. Then came the light. It pulsed across the sky in great shimmering waves, not lightning, not aurora, something else. It rippled, bent, twisted like a living thing, illuminating the storm with an eerie glow that sent shivers down Kai's spine. And then, the town seemed to exhale. For exactly 5 minutes, every piece of technology failed. His truck's dashboard flickered and went dark. The radio cut to static. The streetlights died, plunging the road ahead into absolute blackness. He saw it in the distance. Havenport itself, its skyline dimming, the few scattered neon signs in the downtown area blinking out all at once, as if the town itself had ceased to exist for a brief moment. Kai's pulse quickened. He had spent his life studying anomalies, tracking disturbances in the atmosphere, decoding deep space signals that most people dismissed as nothing but background noise. But this was different. A flash of movement on the road ahead. His foot slammed against the brake, the tires screeching against the rain-slicked pavement as his truck skidded to a stop just in time. A car, or what was left of one. Its front bumper was crushed, the windshield fractured with spiderweb cracks that gleamed in the rain. The driver's side door hung open, swinging lazily with the wind. Kai frowned, reaching for his phone, only to remember that it was dead, just like everything else. He stepped out cautiously, rain soaking his jacket instantly, but he barely noticed as he moved toward the wreck. The headlights were still on, flickering weakly, illuminating the empty interior. No driver, no blood, no signs of a struggle, just a car, abandoned in the middle of the road, as if its occupant had simply ceased to be. And then the lightning came. A flash. Blinding, white-hot. Split the sky, illuminating everything in stark clarity for a single second. And in that second, Kai saw her. She stood just beyond the car, half hidden in the rain and darkness, her figure too still, too out of place. Barefoot. Drenched. But not. Kai's breath caught in his throat, because the rain wasn't touching her. He could see it, water sliding off an invisible barrier around her, never making contact with her skin. Her hair, wild and dripping wet, framed a face too delicate, too lost, as if she had just woken up in a world that wasn't hers. And her eyes. Silver. Not gray. Not blue. Silver. Luminous. Reflecting the lightning like polished metal. The world felt wrong. Like he had stepped into a dream. Or something worse. "Hey!" he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. She flinched. Kai took a cautious step forward, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just stared, like she was trying to figure out what language he was speaking, or if he was even real. Then she took a step toward him. The moment her foot touched the wet pavement, another pulse of lightning illuminated her, and her eyes flashed. Kai froze. It wasn't just a reflection. They were glowing. His breath came shorter now, something deep in his gut telling him that whatever this was, whoever she wasn't normal. Another step. This time, her knees buckled. Kai lunged forward on instinct, catching her just as she collapsed. And then, pain. A shock raced up his arm, sharp and electric, like touching an exposed wire. He hissed, but he didn't let go. The girl gasped, her body trembling violently, her fingers curling into his jacket as if she could anchor herself to him. Kai gritted his teeth against the burning sensation spreading through his fingertips. "Jesus," he muttered. "What the hell?" "I don't know," she whispered. Kai stilled. Her voice was soft, unsteady, barely audible over the rain. She lifted her head slightly, her silver eyes locking onto his. "I don't know where I am," she murmured, her voice shaking. Kai exhaled. "Okay," he said, his mind racing. "Okay, let's just get you out of the rain." She hesitated, as if she wasn't sure she could move, then nodded weakly. Kai adjusted his grip, carefully pulling her toward his truck. The rain pounded against the pavement, the wind howling around them. But he could feel it now. A presence. Something unseen. Watching. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the darkness beyond the trees. Nothing. But that didn't mean nothing was there. He needed to get out of here. Fast. Kai helped her into the passenger seat, closing the door before hurrying around to the driver's side. His hands shook as he started the engine, the low rumble breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over the road. Beside him, the girl sat completely still, eyes trained on the windshield as if she could see through the rain, through the storm, through everything. Kai swallowed hard. He had questions, too many questions, but only one truly mattered right now. He turned to her. "Who are you?" She blinked, a single raindrop sliding down her cheek like a tear. And then, she whispered, "I don't know." Kai didn't move. Didn't breathe. Because somehow, he knew that was the most terrifying answer of all. And from the shadows of the trees, beyond the glow of his headlights, something watched. The drive back to Kai's home was unnervingly silent. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, mist rising from the slick roads as the storm faded into the distance, but the weight of the night still pressed against him. He kept glancing at the girl beside him, Serafina. She sat motionless in the passenger seat, hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes locked on the passing trees outside the window. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way she held herself, something rigid, like a person trying to shrink into the smallest version of themselves. Kai wanted to ask her questions. Who she was, where she had come from, why she had been standing alone in the rain, untouched by it, like some kind of ghost. But something about the moment felt too fragile, as if any wrong move might cause her to fracture completely. So he kept quiet, his fingers tapping anxiously against the steering wheel as they pulled up to the house. It wasn't much, an old yet sturdy home on the outskirts of town, nestled between the thick pines that separated Havenport from the cliffs beyond. It had once belonged to his grandfather, and in more recent years had been home to both him and his grandmother, Eleanor Donovan, a woman who had never ignored the impossible. As Kai stepped out of the truck, he saw the faint glow of a lamp still on inside, the shadow of Eleanor moving in the window. She was awake, as always, a habit she had never quite broken after years spent studying the unknown. Kai helped Serafina out of the truck, leading her up the steps, his mind already racing through what he was going to tell Eleanor. How could he explain something he didn't even understand? The moment he opened the door, Eleanor looked up from the worn-out book she had been reading. Her sharp eyes landed on Serafina. And then, for the briefest second, her entire body stiffened. Not in fear, in recognition. Kai caught the flicker of something in Eleanor's expression before she masked it completely, setting her book aside and pushing up from her chair. "You're late," she said simply, then turned her attention fully to Serafina. Kai cleared his throat. "Yeah, I, ran into something." Eleanor's lips twitched slightly. "So I see." Serafina hesitated, her silver eyes flickering between the two of them, then took a cautious step forward. Eleanor watched her closely, then spoke in a voice softer than before. "You must be cold," she said. "Come in." And just like that, the world shifted. Eleanor had always been a woman of logic. Years spent working as a physicist had made her methodical, precise, always searching for the underlying pattern behind everything. But there was something off about Serafina. Not just the way she carried herself. Unnervingly still, eerily careful, as if afraid of taking up too much space. Not just her strange silver eyes, or the way she had barely reacted to anything around her. It was the energy she carried. Eleanor could feel it. Something deep in her gut told her that this girl was not normal. Kai had filled her in briefly. The car accident, the storm, the way the rain hadn't touched Serafina, the electricity that had surged through him when he made contact with her skin. Eleanor listened without interrupting. And when Kai had finished, she simply nodded. Not in disbelief. Not in shock. But in a way that told Kai she had already suspected as much. Serafina sat quietly at the dining table, eyes downcast, hands folded neatly together. She was too still, too calm. Eleanor set a cup of tea in front of her, studying her closely. Then she asked, "Do you remember anything?" Serafina looked up. And for the first time since Kai had found her, she looked afraid. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know who I am." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, her fingers tapping against the wooden surface. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small blacklight scanner. "Kai," she said, her voice cool and unreadable. "Give me your hand." Kai frowned, but obeyed, extending his palm. Eleanor ran the scanner over his fingertips. A soft green glow appeared, his fingerprints. A completely normal reaction. Then she turned to Serafina. "May I?" she asked. Serafina hesitated, then slowly extended her hand. Eleanor ran the scanner over her skin. Nothing. No glow. No fingerprints. Kai's stomach tightened. What the hell does that mean? Eleanor didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a cotton swab, gently pressing it to Serafina's skin before inserting it into a small biometric analyzer on the counter. The machine whirred to life, scanning for any genetic matches, and then, no match found. Not just in criminal databases, not in any database. Kai felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. "That's not possible." Serafina stared at the screen, unblinking. "I don't exist," she murmured. Kai exhaled sharply. "That's not true." She turned to him, eyes hollow. "Then why can't they find me?" Eleanor remained quiet, though Kai could see the gears turning in her mind. She knew something. She just wasn't saying it yet. Before either of them could speak, the radio crackled. A song. Software haunting. A piano melody drifted through the room, sending a chill down Kai's spine. The sound was old, melancholic, familiar. Then, Serafina gasped. Her entire body locked up, fingers digging into the table, breath shallow and ragged. Kai moved toward her. "Serafina." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know this song," she choked out. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Kai stilled. "You remember it?" She let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. "I know it," she whispered, "but I've never heard it before." The words settled into the air like an unspoken truth. Something wasn't right. Eleanor exhaled slowly, then turned to Kai. "We need to figure out where she came from." Before Kai could respond, headlights flashed through the window. A black car, parked across the street. Kai's stomach dropped. Someone was watching them. And Kai had the sinking feeling that whoever they were, they had been looking for Serafina for a long, long time. The night stretched endlessly, thick with a silence that felt unnatural, as though the very air around them held its breath, waiting. In the dim glow of Eleanor's study, the hum of her computer filled the space, the only sound punctuating the otherwise suffocating stillness. The screens flickered with streams of data, graphs and signals, shifting in erratic patterns that Kai couldn't begin to make sense of. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching as his grandmother's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. She had barely spoken since she had pulled up the signals, her sharp eyes scanning the information with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Serafina sat curled up on the couch by the window, her silver eyes reflecting the glow from the monitors. She was quiet, distant, lost in thought, But Kai had been watching her long enough to notice the tension in her posture, the way her fingers pressed against the fabric of the couch as if grounding herself. She had been like this since the song, since the moment something in her cracked open, something buried so deep that even she hadn't known it was there. He could still hear the way her voice had wavered when she whispered that she knew the song, that she had never heard it before, yet somehow, she had. Eleanor exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. It's not natural. Kai straightened. What isn't? She gestured to the screen. This signal. Her voice was calm, but there was a tightness to it, a hesitation that Kai didn't like. It's been increasing in frequency over the last few days, but I only picked it up after she arrived. Her gaze flickered to Serafina. Serafina's fingers clenched against her lap. What does that mean? Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying her. It means something is looking for you. The words settled like a weight in the room, pressing against them, and Kai felt his pulse quicken. He had known from the moment he found Serafina in the rain that she was different, but hearing it said aloud, spoken so plainly, made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. Serafina swallowed, her throat bobbing as she shifted her gaze to the screen. She didn't seem surprised. If anything, she looked as though she had already known. Kai stepped closer. And what exactly is it? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know, but it's not from here. Serafina flinched at that. Kai frowned. From where then? Eleanor hesitated before answering, as if she were still piecing the words together in her mind. The pattern is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's too structured to be natural, but too unpredictable to be artificial. Whatever it is, it's searching for something. Broadcasting a kind of... She paused, eyes narrowing. A retrieval signal. Kai didn't like the sound of that. Serafina's breath came faster, her fingers curling into her palms. And then, she whispered, I think I remember. Kai turned sharply to her. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fingers to her temples as if trying to hold herself together. Not everything, she said, voice tight, trembling. But pieces. Fragments. Kai crouched in front of her, his heart pounding. What do you see? She shook her head quickly, as if the motion itself could force the memories into place. A city. But not like any city I've ever seen before. The sky was wrong. It wasn't the right color, and there were no stars. Just light. Everywhere. Her hands gripped the sides of her head. I was running. I don't know from what. But I know I was running. Kai shot Eleanor a look, but she was already typing, scanning through the data as if she could somehow match what Serafina was describing with the signals on the screen. Serafina took a shaky breath. I don't think I'm human. Kai felt something inside him go cold. Eleanor remained unreadable, her expression neutral, but Kai had known her long enough to recognize the sharp glint of realization in her eyes. Serafina licked her lips, eyes darting between them. I don't know how I know that, but I do. I was... made. Her voice cracked. I'm not from here. Kai exhaled. You mean Havenport? She shook her head. No. Her silver eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no confusion, just truth. I mean this world. I don't think it's real. Silence. Eleanor was the first to speak. Explain. Serafina trembled. I think I was taken from somewhere else. From a different reality. She pressed a hand against her chest, fingers splayed, as if expecting to feel something beneath her skin. And this place, Havenport, everything around us, it's not the original world. It's something else. Her breathing hitched. I think I was hidden here. Kai's mind reeled. He had spent his life chasing the unknown, searching for patterns in the cosmos, for proof that there was more beyond what they understood. But this wasn't just about aliens, or advanced technology, or things that science hadn't yet caught up to. This was reality itself. Serafina clenched her jaw. I think I'm the reason this world exists. Kai felt his stomach drop. Serafina's fingers dug into the fabric of her jeans, her voice raw. "If I leave, if I figure out the truth." She looked at Kai, her silver eyes wide, pleading. "I think everything here will disappear." He didn't know how to respond. She wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking about Havenport, the people in it, him. Kai's throat went dry. Serafina looked at him desperately. "I don't know what to do." Kai swallowed hard. "If you stay, you'll never know what's real." She shuddered. "But if I leave—" Her breath trembled and her voice broke. "I might erase everything." Kai reached for her hand, gripping it tightly. "Then we figure it out together." Serafina let out a shaky breath, her fingers curling around his, and then the ground trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something deeper, like the very fabric of reality had just shifted. The glasses on the counter rattled. The lights flickered. But beyond the house, outside in the streets of Havenport, the world remained completely still. Eleanor stood abruptly, her face pale. "Did you feel that?" Kai and Serafina nodded. It hadn't been a normal tremor. It had been a warning. Something was coming. And Kai had the sinking feeling that whatever was searching for Serafina had just found them. The night air was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. The hum of the town had faded into the background, drowned out by an eerie quiet that prickled at Kai's skin. He had been on edge since the tremor, since the moment Serafina had whispered the truth that had shattered everything he thought he knew, that the world they lived in might not be real, that she was the key to something far greater, and that her existence here might be the only thing holding it together. Eleanor had been the one to tell them to leave. The urgency in her voice, the way her hands had trembled ever so slightly as she packed up her notes, had sent Kai's instincts screaming. He knew that she didn't rattle easily, and if she was afraid, then it meant something was coming. The black car parked across the street had been the final confirmation. It had been there since last night, its engine off, its windows tinted so dark that no one could see inside. At first, Kai had convinced himself it was just his paranoia, just a coincidence. But when the same car had been waiting at the gas station earlier that day, and again outside the diner where he and Serafina had stopped for coffee, he knew. They were being hunted. Liam had arrived an hour ago, gun tucked into his belt, jaw set in a grim line. He had been skeptical at first, refusing to believe that a government-level organization could have any interest in a girl who, as far as official records were concerned, did not exist. But then, he had seen the way Serafina's fingers hovered over a computer screen, how her gaze flickered with silent recognition as streams of encrypted code unraveled before her like a language only she understood. That was when he had started to believe. And now, standing in the dim light of the living room, Kai felt the weight of the inevitable pressing down on them. The air felt charged, like the moment before a storm, thick with anticipation. Serafina sat on the couch, back straight, hands clasped together tightly. She hadn't spoken in the last 10 minutes, but he could feel the way her body tensed, her muscles coiled as if she were preparing for something she couldn't quite name. Then, a knock at the door. 3 short, deliberate raps. Not a neighbor, not a passerby. A message. Liam was already reaching for his gun, his expression dark. Kai stepped forward instinctively, glancing at Serafina, who had gone completely still. The knock came again. Eleanor exhaled, her eyes flicking toward Serafina. "It's them." The words sent a shiver down Kai's spine. Liam motioned for everyone to stay back as he moved toward the door. He didn't open it, not right away. Instead, he pressed his palm against the wood, as if feeling for something unseen. A voice spoke from the other side. "Open the door, Officer Walker." The tone was smooth, authoritative, calculated. Liam's fingers twitched on his gun. "You have the wrong house." A pause. "I think we both know that's not true." Kai's pulse hammered in his ears. He glanced at Serafina, expecting her to look afraid. But when he met her eyes, what he saw instead was anger. Before anyone could react, the door swung open on its own. A man stepped inside, tall, composed, dressed in a dark coat that fit too perfectly, his presence carrying the weight of someone who knew he belonged wherever he chose to be. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly unmoved by the tension in the room. Declan Rook. Kai didn't need an introduction to know who he was. The agent's gaze flickered to Serafina immediately, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, not curiosity, but recognition. Like she was an equation he had solved long ago. "Serafina," he said smoothly, as if her name was a certainty, not a question. "You've given us quite the chase." Liam raised his gun. "I don't know who the hell you think you are, but you need to get out." He never finished the sentence. The moment Liam took a step forward, he was thrown back violently. His body slammed against the far wall with a force that made the entire house shake, his breath leaving him in a sharp exhale as he crumpled to the floor. Kai's stomach dropped. That hadn't been normal. That had been something else. Serafina shot to her feet, her voice laced with panic. "Stop!" Declan didn't even glance at her. His gaze remained locked on Kai, as if assessing, calculating, measuring his importance. Kai clenched his fists. "What do you want?" Declan tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "Want?" He let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "She's not yours to protect, Mr. Donovan." Something in the way he said it made Kai's skin crawl. Serafina moved then, stepping between them. "You're not taking me," she said, her voice low, steady. Declan studied her, his expression unreadable. "You don't belong here." Serafina's hands trembled at her sides. "I don't belong to you either." Declan exhaled. "You were created for something greater than this, a purpose far beyond what you think you understand." His voice was almost pitying. "Do you really think they can keep you from what you are?" Serafina's body tensed, and then, for the first time, the world around them cracked. Not physically, not in a way anyone else could see. But Kai felt it. A shift in the air, a distortion in reality itself. Declan noticed it too. For the first time, his gaze sharpened, not in control, not amused, but calculating. Serafina exhaled shakily, her silver eyes flickering with something unnatural, something powerful. And then, Liam screamed. Kai turned just in time to see his best friend flicker, his entire form distorting as if he were being unraveled, erased. His voice wasn't just screaming, it was being pulled apart. Kai lunged forward. "No!" But it was too late. Liam disappeared, not gone, erased. His existence simply ceased. The house fell into silence. Kai stood frozen, his breath shallow, his hands shaking. And Declan, unfazed, merely adjusted his cuffs. He looked at Serafina. "You can't run from what you are." But Serafina's expression had changed. She lifted her gaze, silver flashing like molten metal. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid. "No," she whispered, her voice deadly calm. "But I can stop you from taking me." And then, the entire world shattered. The world around them was breaking. The walls of reality, once firm and unyielding, were now fractured, trembling under the weight of an impossible choice. The air itself crackled with an unseen energy, as if the universe was bracing for what was to come. Serafina stood in the center of it all, silver eyes wide, hands trembling at her sides, caught between two fates that neither she nor Kai had ever asked for. She had spent days, weeks in this town, trying to understand who she was, trying to find meaning in the echoes of a life she couldn't remember. And now, standing on the precipice of truth, she realized the cruelest part of it all. Havenport was never real. It had felt real. The smell of the sea carried in by the morning breeze, the laughter of children playing outside the diner, the warmth of Kai's presence beside her in the quiet hours of the night. But it had never been meant to last. She had been hidden here, placed in this version of reality, not to live, but to be contained. And now that she had begun to wake up, now that she had started to remember the truth, the world was unraveling. She could feel it in the ground beneath her feet, in the way the sky flickered, its stars glitching in and out of existence. Havenport wasn't dying. It was ceasing to be, because it had never truly existed in the first place. Kai stood a few steps away, watching her with an expression that was both steady and heartbroken, as if he already knew what she had to do. His face was lined with exhaustion, bruises from the earlier fight still darkening his skin, but his blue eyes never wavered from hers. "Talk to me," he said, his voice soft but insistent, as if willing her to stay grounded in this moment for just a little longer. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I have to leave." The words felt like knives in her throat. Kai didn't react, not at first. He only nodded, as if he had already prepared himself for this answer. But the way his hands clenched at his sides, the way his jaw tensed ever so slightly, told her that he was fighting against every instinct that told him to beg her to stay. "You said if you leave, this place—" He hesitated, looking around at the town that had been his home for as long as he could remember. The buildings standing just as they always had, except now, they flickered at the edges, like static creeping into the frame of an old photograph. "It'll disappear, won't it?" Serafina closed her eyes for a brief second, listening to the hum of the world collapsing in on itself. "Yes." Kai exhaled sharply. "And if you stay?" She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, and in that moment she saw everything. The pain, the love, the desperation, the knowledge that he would never ask her to give up her truth for his sake. "If I stay, I'll never know who I really am." The weight of the answer settled between them. Kai took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth of him, grounding her in a way that nothing else ever had. His hand lifted, hesitating for just a second before his fingers brushed against her cheek, tracing the edge of her jaw. His touch was steady, familiar, like an anchor in a storm. "If you go," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "and you forget this, forget me." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "Promise me you'll find me again." Serafina's breath hitched, her throat tightening so painfully she thought she might break apart right then and there. She had no memories of love, no past filled with warm embraces or whispered confessions in the dark. But this was real. Kai was real. And he was the only real thing she had ever known. Her hands reached up, covering his, pressing his palm against her cheek as she tried to memorize the feeling, the warmth, the steadiness of him. Tears blurred her vision, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You are the only light I've ever known." Kai's expression cracked, his lips pressing into a tremulous smile even as his own eyes burned. "Then find me," he said, his fingers tightening slightly, as if trying to memorize her too. "No matter where, no matter who I am." Serafina let out a shuddering breath, nodding, even though she didn't know how, even though she wasn't sure if fate would be kind enough to allow them to meet again. She wanted to tell him more, wanted to say she was sorry, that she wished things had been different, that she wanted more time. But time had already run out. The ground beneath them trembled, the air vibrating with an unseen force, the fabric of the world unraveling at the seams. The trees at the edge of town blurred, the buildings wavered like mirages in the heat, and somewhere in the distance, a voice, not human, not earthly, whispered her name. She only had seconds now. Her grip on Kai tightened. And then she let go. A pulse of light erupted from her chest, spreading outward in waves, swallowing the town, the sky, everything around them. Kai's eyes widened, his body flickering like a shadow caught between two realities. He opened his mouth, to call her name, to reach for her, to fight fate itself. But the world had already started to erase him. The last thing Serafina saw before the light consumed everything was his smile, the way his lips formed her name one final time. And then, nothing. Havenport was gone, Kai was gone, and Serafina was alone, floating in an empty void of silence, weightless, untethered. She had made her choice. And now, there was only darkness. The city was alive, its neon lights casting a soft glow on the rain-slicked pavement, the hum of distant traffic filling the air with an almost hypnotic rhythm. It was a world that pulsed with movement, with purpose, a place where people moved in hurried strides, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phone screens, their minds lost in conversations and destinations that no longer meant anything to Kai. He had spent 2 years in this place, existing, but never truly belonging. Every morning, he woke up with the same dull ache in his chest, an absence he could never name, a shadow in his mind that refused to be filled. He worked at the university's observatory, spent his nights staring at the stars, searching for something he wasn't even sure existed. He should have felt at home among the endless galaxies, should have found comfort in the knowledge that he was peering into the unknown. And yet, every time he looked up, every time he traced the patterns of constellations he had memorized since childhood, he felt the weight of something missing, something just beyond his reach. The dreams were the worst part. They came in flashes, fragmented images that never made sense, a storm raging over a quiet town, the sound of laughter echoing through a space he didn't recognize, the warmth of fingers brushing against his skin, a voice whispering his name. He always woke up before he could grasp any of it, before he could see the face that haunted him in ways he didn't understand. And then morning would come, and he would push it all away, telling himself that some things were never meant to be remembered. But the universe had never been that kind to him. The cafe was small, tucked between 2 towering buildings, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Kai hadn't planned on stopping, but the rain had started suddenly, and he had stepped under the awning without thinking, shaking the droplets from his jacket as he glanced through the glass. That was when he saw her. She was sitting at a table near the window, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee, her silver eyes focused on something outside, lost in thought. Her dark hair fell over one shoulder, and she looked peaceful, as if she belonged here, as if she had always been part of this world, unburdened by the weight of anything else. His heart stopped. His breath left him in a sharp exhale, his vision narrowing to nothing but her. Serafina. The name formed in his mind instinctively, slipping past the barriers of time and memory, breaking through the fog that had settled over his past. The missing pieces, the ache, the dreams, the feeling of being lost in his own life. All of it suddenly made sense. She was real, and she was here. His feet carried him forward before he even realized what he was doing, the door swinging open with the soft chime of a bell. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around him, but he felt cold, weightless, caught in the gravity of a moment he had never expected to have. He stopped beside her table, his hands trembling slightly as he forced himself to speak. "Serafina?" She looked up. For a brief second, something flickered in her expression. Recognition, hesitation, the whisper of something familiar. And then it was gone, smoothed over in an instant, replaced by polite curiosity. She tilted her head slightly, offering him a small, hesitant smile. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The world tilted. Kai felt his stomach drop, his chest constricting with an ache so sharp it nearly stole the breath from his lungs. She didn't remember. She was looking at him the way strangers did, with a soft kindness, but no depth, no understanding of who he was or what they had been. It was wrong. It was so wrong. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to stay steady. He hesitated, his mind scrambling for something to say, some way to make her remember. But what if she truly didn't? What if this was a different version of her? A version that had never known Havenport, that had never known him? His throat tightened. "Sorry. I must have mistaken you for someone else." She nodded, her gaze lingering on his face for just a second too long, as if she too felt something she couldn't quite name. Then, with another polite smile, she turned back to her coffee, as if the moment had never happened. Kai stood there for a few seconds, his hands curling into fists at his sides, his mind screaming at him to do something, to say something, to make her remember. but some things couldn't be forced. And maybe, just maybe, fate wasn't done with them yet. He took a slow step back, watching her, memorizing the way the light caught in her silver eyes, the way she twirled her spoon absent-mindedly between her fingers. He didn't know how or when or if she would ever truly remember, but he knew one thing: she was here. And that meant he would find a way back to her, no matter what it took. Outside, the rain continued to fall, the city moving forward as if nothing had changed. But for Kai, everything had. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets washed in a soft golden glow from the streetlights that flickered overhead. The scent of damp pavement lingered in the air, mixing with the rich aroma of coffee that drifted through the cafe's open doors. Kai sat at a corner table, fingers wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold, his mind elsewhere. Outside the window, the world moved as it always did. People coming and going, conversations blending into the hum of city life. And then, there she was. Serafina. She moved through the cafe with a quiet grace, her silver eyes scanning the room as if looking for something she couldn't name. She had no reason to notice him, no reason to pause. But she did. For the briefest moment their eyes met across the space, and something flickered in her gaze. A hesitation, a whisper of something just beyond reach. She didn't remember, not in the way he did, but she felt something, and that was enough. Kai wasn't a believer in fate. He had spent his life chasing logic, mapping the cosmos in search of answers that made sense, grounding himself in things that could be measured and explained. But none of that accounted for the pull in his chest, the way his world had tilted the second he saw her again. Serafina lingered near the counter, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup absent-mindedly, her expression distant. She didn't know why she kept looking at him, why something about him felt familiar when it shouldn't. There was no memory attached to the feeling, just a quiet certainty that he mattered. Kai set his cup down, pushing aside the weight of uncertainty. He wasn't going to let this slip away. Not again. He stood, making his way toward her, careful not to startle her. When he was close enough, he spoke, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "You keep looking at me," he said, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. Serafina blinked, caught off guard. Then after a pause, she smiled, a hesitant, uncertain thing. "I'm sorry, She exhaled, shaking her head. "You seem familiar." Kai's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her everything. About Havenport. About the life they had lost. About the moment she had disappeared, taking an entire world with her. But this wasn't something he could force. So instead, he leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "Maybe we've met before." She tilted her head slightly, considering. Maybe. He could see the doubt in her eyes, the frustration of knowing something without knowing why. It was the same feeling that had haunted him for 2 years, the constant ache of something missing. But this wasn't just about him. Lucid hadn't given up. They were still out there, watching, waiting. He had seen the same black car parked outside the cafe 3 nights in a row, the same figures lingering in the shadows, just out of reach. If they knew she was here, if they realized she was starting to remember, he had to be careful. "I don't usually do this," he said, forcing a lightness into his tone. "But do you want to get coffee sometime?" Serafina's lips parted slightly, her silver eyes searching his, as if trying to decide whether to say yes. And then, she nodded. "Yeah," she murmured. "I think I'd like that." Kai released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The hunt wasn't over. Lucid would come. He knew that. But for now, he had found her again. And no matter what came next, he wasn't letting go. Because some things, no matter how many times they were erased, were never truly lost. And some loves were strong enough to defy even reality itself. Across the galaxies, across time itself. "You've found your way here," Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far across the universe our community reaches. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the unknown. You won't want to miss it.